No one remembered the last time a battle surprised anyone. Wars in the galaxy were math problems. You counted your ships, counted the enemy's ships, calculated shield ratings, weapon yields, and trajectories, and then you knew who would win before the first shot was fired. It had been this way for 200 years, ever since the Shivari Dominion started swallowing star systems and the Galactic Concord formed to stop them. Every species in the Concord accepted this. War was physics. Physics did not lie. Admiral Ren Hadley had spent his entire career being told this, and he had spent his entire career quietly disagreeing. He sat in the command chair of the Avalon, a mid-sized human cruiser that looked like a toy next to the Tez-Sherry dreadnoughts surrounding it. The 9th Combined Fleet had just dropped out of warp above Drenera, a green and gold world that the Shivari wanted and the Concord intended to keep. 2,000 Allied ships spread across the void in perfect geometric formations. Across from them, the Shivari fleet waited. Bigger, meaner, more numerous. Fleet Overseer Delon's face filled the comm screen. The Tez-Sherry was tall and sharp-featured, with skin that looked like cracked quartz. His voice carried the calm of someone who had already done the math. "The projections are clear," Delon said. "We will lose approximately 60% of our forward screen, but we will hold the orbital corridor. The Shivari will withdraw after sustaining 45% losses. This is acceptable." Hadley leaned forward. "Overseer, I would like to propose an alternative formation that could reduce our losses to under 30%. Delon's crystalline eyes did not blink. "Your species has been spacefaring for less than 3 centuries, Admiral. The Tez-Sherry have fought wars for 4,000 years. The formation holds." The comm cut off. Hadley exhaled slowly and turned to his tactical officer. Lieutenant Priya Nair was already hunched over her console, fingers flying across data streams. She was the kind of person who solved puzzles in her sleep and woke up annoyed that the solutions were too simple. "He said no," Hadley told her. "I heard." Priya did not look up. "I'm running the alternative simulations anyway." The battle began exactly on schedule. The Concord fleet advanced. The Shivari fleet advanced. Weapons fired along calculated vectors. Shields absorbed damage at predicted rates. Ships died in the order that the computers said they would. It was not a battle. It was an equation solving itself. Hadley watched the sensor feeds with the patience of a man waiting for a crack in a wall. He had learned long ago that the problem with perfect systems was that they made people stop looking for imperfections. Everyone was so focused on the math in front of them that no one watched the edges. And that was where he saw it. A Shivari flagship, far behind the front lines, adjusted its position by 0.003 degrees. It was nothing. A rounding error. The kind of micro-correction that automated systems made 1,000 times during any engagement. But Hadley had been staring at the Shivari rear formation for 20 minutes, and this was the 7th such correction, each one angling the ship slightly closer to Drenera's largest moon. "Priya," he said quietly, "pull up the gravitational map for that moon." She did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "They are building a slingshot," Priya whispered. Hadley nodded. The Shivari rear fleet, 400 ships that everyone assumed were reserves, was slowly drifting into a gravitational corridor around the moon. Once they hit the right position, the moon's gravity would accelerate them to a speed that no Concord ship could match. They would swing around and hit the Allied fleet from the side like a hammer. "How long?" Hadley asked. 2 hours. Maybe less. Hadley opened a channel to the flagship. "Overseer Delon, I have urgent tactical intelligence. The Shivari rear formation is positioning for a gravitational slingshot around the Drenera moon. In less than 2 hours, 400 ships will flank us at speeds our shields cannot handle." Delon's response was immediate and flat. "I see no deviation in the Shivari formation that falls outside standard predictive variance. You are reacting to noise, Admiral." "Overseer, the cumulative drift of their rear ships is consistent with the planned maneuver. If we do not act now, this fleet is dead. The math does not support your claim. Hold your position. The channel closed. Hadley sat still for a long moment. Around him, the battle raged in its neat, predictable way. Ships fired. Ships burned. The numbers ticked down exactly as everyone expected. Priya turned to face him. He will not listen. No. So what do we do? Hadley looked at the 40 human ships scattered through the formation. 40 out of 2,000. A drop of water in a burning sea. Then he looked at the moon on the sensor display, and the 400 Shivari ships creeping toward it like wolves circling a campfire. He pressed the fleet-wide call for the human contingent. All human vessels, this is Admiral Hadley. Break formation immediately and set course for the following coordinates. I will explain on the way. The reaction from the Concorde fleet was instant. Warning signals flashed. Delon's voice cut through every channel, cold and furious. Admiral Hadley, you are in violation of Concorde military code. Return to formation or you will be declared a deserter. Hadley muted the channel. 40 human ships pulled away from the fleet and accelerated toward the empty space near the moon. Behind them, 2,000 Allied vessels continued fighting the neat, orderly, perfectly predicted battle. Ahead of them, 400 Shivari warships were picking up speed. There was a saying among the Palori, the oldest warrior species in the Concorde. Trust the numbers, and the numbers will bury you with dignity. Sub-Commander Grosk had repeated that saying 1,000 times in 60 years of war. He had never once questioned what it actually meant until he watched 40 human ships fly toward an empty moon. Grosk was old, even by Palori standards. His scaled hide was scarred from a dozen campaigns. His ship, the Ironfall, was nearly as battered as he was. He had fought the Shivari across more star systems than he could remember, and every single engagement had gone the same way. You lined up. You fired. You counted the dead. You went home. The math always held. But now, standing in his weapons console on the Concorde flagship's tactical deck, Grosk could not stop staring at the sensor feed. 40 tiny dots pulling away from the fleet. Moving fast. Moving with purpose. Moving toward nothing dot, or toward something no one else could see. Grosk left his station without permission and walked to the secondary comm room. He opened a private channel to the Avalon. It took 15 seconds for Hadley to answer, and when the human's face appeared on the screen, he did not look like a deserter. He looked like a man who was very, very busy. "Sub-Commander," Hadley said, "I did not expect a call from anyone on the flagship. Tell me what you see." Grosk said, "The thing with the moon." Hadley studied the old Palori for a moment. Then he shared his screen. The gravitational map appeared, overlaid with the movement tracks of the Shivari rear fleet. 400 ships, drifting slowly but steadily into a corridor where the moon's gravity would grab them and hurl them forward at terrible speed. "They're using the moon as a weapon," Hadley explained. "A gravitational slingshot. Every small course correction they have made in the last hour pushes them deeper into the acceleration lane. In about 90 minutes, they will swing around the moon and hit our fleet from the side at speeds our shields were never designed to stop." Grosk stared at the data. He had been a warrior for 6 decades. He had never once looked at what the reserve fleet was doing during a battle. No one did. The reserves were reserves. They sat behind the line and waited. "Why is Delon not listening?" Grosk asked. "Because the deviation of each individual ship is within normal predictive variance," Hadley said. "He is looking at each correction separately. I am looking at all of them together." Grosk understood immediately. It was the difference between watching one raindrop and seeing the flood. "What are you planning to do with 40 ships against 400? Grosk asked. "I'm not going to fight them." Grosk waited. "I'm going to fill their acceleration lane with garbage," Hadley said. For a long moment, Grosk said nothing. Then a sound came from his chest that Hadley had never heard before, a low, grinding rumble. It took Hadley a few seconds to realize the Palori was laughing. Back on the Avalon, Priya was running calculations so fast her fingers were a blur. The slingshot corridor was a narrow band of space where the moon's gravity created perfect acceleration conditions. Anything in that corridor would be dragged along at the same increasing speed, including debris. At the velocity they will reach, Priya said without looking up, a 1 kilogram bolt will impact with the force of a guided torpedo. A fuel canister will hit like a capital ship's main gun. Hadley nodded. Start dumping everything we do not need. Hull plating from the repair bays. Spent fuel containers. Broken sensor pods. Carbohydrates. All of it. Spread it across the widest section of the corridor. The order went out to all 40 human ships. Within minutes, airlocks opened and the void filled with junk. Twisted metal, empty canisters, cracked plating, stripped bolts, shattered components. It looked absurd. It looked like a fleet throwing a tantrum. IT was the most dangerous minefield in the history of galactic warfare. Priya tracked each piece of debris as the moon's gravity caught it and began pulling it along the same corridor the Shivari would use. The debris accelerated slowly at first, then faster, spinning and tumbling through the gravitational lane like stones in a river. On the flagship, Grosk made a decision. He contacted 3 Palori captains he trusted, old soldiers like him, tired of watching wars go exactly as predicted. He told them what the human was doing. He told them to start dumping their own waste and spent ordnance into cargo pods and launching them on low-power trajectories toward the moon. This is a violation of fleet orders, one captain said. So is losing, Gross replied. The pods launched quietly, hidden in the chaos of the ongoing battle. Small contributions, but contributions nonetheless. The debris field in the slingshot corridor thickened. 50 minutes remained before the Shivari fleet would commit to the slingshot. On the Shivari side, sensors began picking up the debris. Scattered readings. Small objects drifting in the gravitational corridor. Their analysts flagged it as natural space junk, common near moons. A few officers raised concerns, but the numbers were tiny. A few hundred pieces of debris against 400 shielded warships. The math said it was nothing. The Shivari committed. 400 warships locked into the gravitational corridor and began their acceleration run. The moon's gravity grabbed them and pulled. Slowly at first, then faster. Their speed climbed past combat norms, past engagement ratings, past anything the Concorde had ever faced. Ahead of them, unseen and uncounted, thousands of pieces of metal and junk tumbled through the same corridor, accelerating at the same rate, waiting like teeth in a dark mouth. Hadley watched the velocity readings climb on his screen and leaned back in his chair. Priya, he said quietly, this is the part where we find out if physics has a sense of humor. In the deep cold between a planet and its moon, where gravity pulled everything forward and nothing could stop, the oldest law in the universe was about to prove a point. Mass times velocity equals force. Every child in the galaxy learned it before they learned to read. The Shivari had forgotten it. Not the formula, they could recite it perfectly. But they had forgotten what it felt like when it turned against you. 400 Shivari warships screamed through the gravitational corridor at speeds that made their own sensors lag. The moon's pull was relentless, adding velocity every second. Their formation was tight and clean, a spear aimed at the Concorde fleet's exposed side. In less than 8 minutes, they would swing around the moon and strike with more kinetic energy than any fleet engagement in the history of the war. Ahead of them, invisible against the blackness, thousands of pieces of scrap metal tumbled through the same corridor. The first impact was a fuel canister. Empty. Maybe 20 kilograms of thin metal. At the speed the lead Shivari destroyer was traveling, it hit the forward shield with the force of a heavy torpedo. The shield flickered. The second impact was a cracked hull plate. 40 kilograms. It punched through the weakened shield and sheared off a sensor array. Then the rest arrived at IT was not an explosion. It was a sandstorm made of metal. Bolts, brackets, cargo containers, stripped wiring, broken panels, every piece of junk that 40 human ships and a handful of Palori vessels had dumped into the corridor. Each piece was small. Each piece was traveling at a speed that turned it into a weapon that no shield generator in the galaxy was designed to stop. The lead ships took the worst of it. Shields built to absorb focused energy beams collapsed under thousands of simultaneous kinetic strikes. Hull plating crumpled. Engines ruptured. 3 destroyers broke apart in the first 15 seconds, their wreckage adding to the debris field and creating even more projectiles for the ships behind them. On the Avalon, Priya tracked the carnage with wide eyes. 60 ships have lost shields. 22 have critical hull breaches. Their formation is breaking. Hadley watched the sensor display. The Shivari spear was shattering. Damaged ships drifted sideways, blocking the paths of ships behind them. Collisions happened. Not the clean, calculated collisions of war, but the ugly, stupid collisions of vehicles crashing on a crowded road. Ships slammed into crippled ships. Engines firing to avoid one wreck sent vessels spinning into another. Physics did not care about rank or doctrine. It only cared about mass and speed, and there was far too much of both in that corridor. Across the void on the Concorde flagship, the tactical display lit up with alerts. DeLon stood at the center of his command deck and watched the Shivari slingshot maneuver. The maneuver he had dismissed as a fantasy tear itself apart on a field of floating garbage. The bridge was silent. Every Tesheri officer stared at their screens. The numbers were impossible. The Shivari had lost over 60 ships in under a minute without a single weapon being fired at them. Their own speed had killed them. Grosk, standing near the back of the tactical deck, allowed himself a thin smile. The old Palori had seen 60 years of war fought with lasers and plasma and guided missiles. He had never seen anyone win a battle with trash. The surviving Shivari ships burst out of the corridor in a ragged, scattered mess. What should have been a precise flanking strike became a disorganized swarm of damaged vessels tumbling out of the moon's shadow. Their speed was still enormous, but their formation was gone. Their shields were depleted, and their command structure was in chaos. Priya updated the numbers. Approximately 260 ships remain combat-capable, but they are scattered across a wide area and will need at least 20 minutes to regroup. Hadley opened a channel to the Concorde flagship. This time, DeLon answered immediately. The Teshari's crystalline face was unreadable, but his voice had lost its certainty. Admiral Hadley. Overseer DeLon. A long pause. The sounds of battle filled the gap. Then DeLon asked a single question, stripped of pride and doctrine and 4,000 years of Tesheri military tradition. What do you recommend? Hadley did not gloat. He did not remind DeLon that he had been right. There was no time for that, and it was not the kind of man he was. The Shivari flanking force is broken and scattered. They will regroup in 20 minutes and still outnumber my 40 ships 10-1. But right now, in this moment, they are confused, damaged, and afraid. They have never been afraid before, Overseer. Their math has always protected them. Right now, their math is lying in pieces in that corridor. What are you asking for? Everything. Every ship in the 9th Fleet. I want to charge them before they recover. DeLon's officers exchanged glances. Charging an enemy fleet went against every doctrine in the Concorde military. You held formation. You calculated. You waited. You never, ever rushed headlong into the enemy because the math said it was wasteful. But the math had also said the slingshot would work. DeLon straightened. You have tactical command, Admiral. All ships will respond to your orders. Hadley closed the channel and looked at Priya. She was already laying in new coordinates. All Concorde vessels. Hadley broadcast to 2,000 ships. This is Admiral Hadley. Break formation. All ahead full. We're going straight at them. The fleet surged forward like a wave breaking free of a dam. Behind them, the orderly geometry of 200 years of galactic warfare dissolved. Ahead of them, The scattered remains of the Shivari flanking fleet drifted in confusion, and somewhere in between, the old rules stopped applying. 2,000 ships charging at once made a sound that sensors were not built to describe. It was not a roar or a hum or a scream. It was a frequency that the instruments translated as a wall of energy signatures moving in the same direction at the same time, and every species on every bridge felt it in a different way. The Tezsheri felt it as vibration in their crystal bones. The Palori felt it as heat in their scaled hides. The humans felt it as the thing they had always called momentum. The Concorde fleet slammed into the scattered Shivari formation like a fist in a broken glass. There was no order to it. That was the point. Every battle in the 200-year war had been fought in neat lines, with predictable distances and calculated firing arcs. The Shivari were masters of this style. Their ships were designed for it. Their officers were trained for it. Their entire military philosophy was built on the idea that if you could calculate every variable, you could control every outcome, and no one had ever charged them at close range. Hadley's 40 human ships led the way, darting through the gaps between larger Concorde vessels like small fish leading a whale pod. They were fast and light, and their pilots flew with the kind of reckless precision that came from a species that had invented both the seatbelt and the reason the seatbelt was necessary. Spread wide, Hadley ordered. Draw their fire. Make them chase you. Do not let them form a line. The human ships scattered through the Shivari formation, firing short bursts, cutting across bow lines, ducking behind damaged vessels. They were not trying to destroy anything. They were trying to create chaos. It worked. Shivari gunners, trained to fire at targets on predictable trajectories, could not track enemies that changed direction every 3 seconds. Ships that tried to rotate and follow the human cruisers exposed their flanks to the heavier Concorde dreadnoughts, now pouring into the melee. Weapons designed for long-range precision became clumsy at close quarters. Shots meant for human ships struck Shivari ships instead. Grosk brought the Iron Fall into the heart of it. His old warship was slow and heavy, but at close range that meant nothing. He locked onto a Shivari cruiser that was trying to target a disabled Concorde medical frigate and drove straight at it. The Iron Fall's bow shields absorbed 2 direct hits. Then Grosk rammed his ship into the cruiser's engine section at quarter speed. The impact threw everyone on both bridges to the floor. Metal screamed against metal. The Shivari cruiser's engines died. The Iron Fall bounced backward, trailing sparks and venting atmosphere from a dozen small breaches. Grosk pulled himself back into his chair and opened a comm channel. "This is Subcommander Grosk. I have just but a Shivari cruiser. I think I finally understand why humans are insane." He paused. "It is because sanity is too slow." Laughter crackled across the fleet comms. It was a strange sound in the middle of a battle, but it was human, and it was spreading on the flagship. DeLon watched the battle with an expression that no Tezsheri had words for. The tactical display was useless. Every predictive model was flashing errors. Ships were not dying at calculated rates. The Concorde was losing fewer vessels than any simulation suggested, because the Shivari could not aim when their targets refused to behave like targets. A young Tezsheri officer near the sensor station spoke without being addressed, which was itself a breach of protocol. "Overseer, we should be recording everything. Future generations will need to study this." DeLon looked at her. "You are correct. Begin recording." He paused. "But I suspect that studying it and understanding it will prove to be 2 very different things." The battle raged for another 40 minutes. It was ugly and messy and nothing like the clean engagements that filled the Concorde's tactical archives. Ships collided. Firing arcs overlapped. Wreckage tumbled through the combat zone, creating obstacles that forced both sides to dodge and weave. But the Concorde was adapting. The human ships showed the way, and slowly, other species followed. Palori warships began working in pairs, one drawing fire while the other struck from the side. Tertiary destroyers, built for precision, found that their targeting systems worked beautifully at close range when the enemy could not run. Even the small, quick scouts from the Fenari contingent found their role, zipping between larger ships and relaying real-time position data. The Shivari were not adapting. They could not. Their doctrine was built on distance and calculation, and both were gone. Commanders shouted orders that no longer applied. Ships tried to form lines that collapsed the moment a human cruiser cut through them. The elegant machinery of the Dominion's war engine ground against itself and began a break. The Shivari admiral ordered a retreat. It was the first time in 200 years that a Shivari fleet had retreated from a force of equal or lesser strength. But the retreat was as messy as the battle. Ships collided during turns. Jump coordinates were miscalculated in the panic. What should have been an orderly withdrawal became a scramble. Hadley watched them run. He did not pursue. His fleet was battered, tired, and low on everything. "Priya," he said, "damage report. We lost 312 ships. The Shivari lost over 400, plus the 60 from the slingshot corridor." She looked up. Every model predicted we would lose 1,200. Hadley nodded slowly. Then the long-range sensor alarm screamed. Priya's face went white. "Admiral, Second Fleet, 800 ships, dropping out of warp on the far side of the system." Hadley stared at the display. 800 fresh warships, untouched and in perfect formation. "The First Fleet was the bait," he said quietly. The real battle had not even started. Fear was supposed to be irrational. Every species in the Concord taught their officers that fear was a chemical glitch, something to be managed with training and medication and discipline. The Tertiary had equations for it. The Palori had rituals. The Fenari had breathing exercises that took 4 minutes and involved humming. Humans had something else. They had learned a very long time ago that fear was not the enemy. Panic was. And the distance between the two was where wars were won. Hadley felt the fear. 800 fresh Shivari warships in perfect formation on the far side of the system, moving with the slow confidence of a predator that knew its prey was already bleeding. His fleet had 1,500 ships still able to fight, but they were damaged, scattered, and nearly out of ammunition. The math was clear. Retreat was the only logical option. DeLon said as much. "Admiral, our losses are within acceptable range. If we withdraw now, we preserve 1,100 combat-capable vessels for future engagements. Drenera can be retaken later." Hadley stared at the sensor display. The second Shivari fleet was advancing in a wide crescent formation, their spacing carefully designed to prevent any debris tricks. They had clearly received reports from the first engagement. No gravitational bodies were nearby. No slingshot corridors to exploit. They were coming straight, clean, and overwhelming. "If we run," Hadley said slowly, "we teach them that the first battle was a fluke. A trick that worked once. They adjust their doctrine, patch the hole, and the next time we meet them, they are ready for everything we showed them today. And if we stay," DeLon replied, "we lose this fleet. Maybe. Or maybe we teach them something they cannot patch." Hadley opened a channel to Priya. "I need you to compile the complete sensor logs from the first engagement. Every angle, every moment, the debris field, the slingshot collapse, the charge, all of it." Priya frowned. "For the after-action report?" "No, for the Shivari." It took Priya 4 seconds to understand. Then she started working. Hadley broadcast the compiled sensor logs on every Shivari military frequency. Unencrypted, unedited. The complete record of 400 Shivari warships being destroyed by floating junk and a reckless charge that broke every rule of galactic warfare. He sent it in every data format the Concord had ever intercepted from the Dominion. He made sure every ship in that second fleet could see it. Then he waited. The second fleet slowed. Not much. A fraction of a percent reduction in forward velocity. But Hadley saw it, and Priya saw it, and in the silence of the Avalon's bridge, they looked at each other and knew. They are arguing. Hadley said he was right. On the Shivari command ships, officers watched the sensor logs with growing unease. The footage showed tactics that no simulation in the Dominion's database could predict. Ships dumping garbage. A fleet charging headlong into the enemy. A 60-year veteran ramming his ship into a cruiser for no mathematical reason at all. The Shivari models could not explain what had happened, which meant they could not predict what would happen next. And the Shivari had never fought an enemy they could not predict that on the Concorde side. Something else was happening. Grosk, his ship barely holding together, moved to the front of the formation. He did not say anything dramatic on the comms. He simply positioned the Ironfall at the leading edge of the fleet and pointed its battered nose at the incoming armada. Other captains watched. A Palori frigate moved up beside him. Then a Tez-Sherry destroyer. Then 2 Fenari scouts. One by one, ships from a dozen different species drifted to the front of the formation and faced the approaching enemy. That IT was not an order. Hadley had not asked for it. It was something else, something that the Concorde's tactical manuals had no chapter for. It was a choice. Every captain who moved forward was choosing to stand, not because the math said they should, but because the human had shown them that the math was not the only thing that mattered. Priya counted. 600 ships have moved to the forward screen. Without orders. Hadley felt something tighten in his chest. He had commanded human ships for 20 years. He had never commanded belief. DeLon spoke from the flagship, and his voice was different now. Quieter. Admiral, I have studied warfare for 200 years. I have memorized 10,000 engagements. I have never seen this. Seen what? Overseer. A fleet that wants to fight when the numbers say it should not. Hadley almost smiled. Overseer. Where I come from, we have a word for that. What word? Stubborn. The second Shivari fleet continued to decelerate. Their formation was still perfect, still wide, still designed to overwhelm. But their speed kept dropping. Minutes passed. The gap between the fleets closed at a crawl instead of a rush. Priya monitored the Shivari comm frequencies. She could not decrypt the content, but she could measure the volume. The amount of intership communication in the second fleet had tripled in the last 10 minutes. They were not coordinating an attack. They were debating one. Hadley leaned back in his chair and watched the distance counter tick down. He had no more tricks, no more debris, no more gravitational corridors. All he had was 1,500 damaged ships, a crew that trusted him, and the simple, stubborn fact that he was not leaving. The Shivari fleet stopped point 800 warships, arranged in a perfect crescent, hung motionless in the void. The Concorde fleet faced them, battered and defiant. Neither side fired. The distance between them was 400,000 kilometers. Close enough to fight, far enough to think. And for the first time in 200 years, the Shivari were thinking. 6 hours. That was how long the two fleets stared at each other across 400,000 kilometers of nothing. 6 hours of silence, sensor sweeps, and the slow, grinding tension of waiting for someone to blink on the Avalon. Nobody slept. Hadley sat in his command chair with a cup of cold water balanced on his knee, watching the Shivari formation for any sign of movement. His crew rotated through short breaks, eating ration bars at their stations and speaking in whispers as if the enemy might hear them through the vacuum. Priya had not left her console once. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her fingers trembled slightly over the controls, but she tracked every fluctuation in the Shivari fleet with the obsessive focus of someone defusing a bomb. Their formation is drifting, she said during the 4th hour. Micro-corrections every few minutes. They are holding position, but it is costing them fuel. Good, Hadley said. Let them burn it. On the flagship, DeLon stood at the center of his command deck, like a statue carved from quartz. The Tez-Sherry did not sit during standoffs. It was a cultural thing, or maybe a pride thing. After 6 hours, even his officers had stopped being impressed by it. Gross slept in his chair on the ironfall. The old Palori had learned decades ago that you slept when you could, because War did not care about your schedule. He had told his crew to wake him if the Shivari moved or if the whole breach on deck 4 got worse. Neither happened. During the 5th hour, Priya detected something new. Admiral, 3 Shivari vessels have powered down their forward weapons arrays. Hadley leaned forward. Damn it. No. Deliberate shutdown. They are. I think they're standing down. More ships followed. Across the Shivari crescent, weapon systems went cold in 1s and 2s, then dozens. It was not a coordinated action. It was a slow, spreading decision, like soldiers lowering their rifles one at a time because no one wanted to be the first, but no one wanted to fire either. By the end of the 5th hour, over half the Shivari fleet had reduced their weapons to standby mode. Then at the 6-hour mark, the Shivari fleet turned. Not fast, not in panic. 800 warships rotated in a wide, slow arc, like a massive door swinging shut, and began moving away from Drenera. Their formation held. Their speed was measured. It was not a retreat. It was a withdrawal. The difference mattered to them, even if it looked the same from the outside. Priya exhaled so hard that the officer next to her flinched. They are leaving. Hadley watched the Shivari fleet shrink on the sensor display. He did not cheer. He did not pump his fist or shout or cry. He sat in his chair and watched 800 warships decide, for the first time in 2 centuries of conflict, that the math was not enough to make them fight. The comm channels erupted, cheering in a dozen languages and frequencies. Palori battle cries, Finari harmonic songs that made the speakers buzz, Tesheri voices reciting victory codes that sounded like poetry. And underneath it all, the rough, ragged, happy shouting of human crews who had not expected to survive the day. Grosk woke up to the noise. He blinked at his tactical display, saw the retreating Shivari fleet, and grunted. Then he opened a channel to the Avalon. Admiral, did we win? Hadley considered the question. We did not lose. Close enough. Grosk paused. I need to repair my ship. I think I left part of it inside that Shivari cruiser. In the days that followed, the 9th Combined Fleet limped to the nearest Concord repair station. 312 ships had been lost. Thousands of crew members from a dozen species had died. Drenera was safe, but the cost sat heavy on everyone who had been there. Delon filed his official report to the Galactic Concord War Council. It was the longest report he had ever written, which was notable because the Tesheri were famous for reports that could be measured by weight. He detailed every phase of the battle, from the predicted engagement to the slingshot trap, the debris field, the charge, and the standoff. The final line of the report read, "Humanity does not break the laws of motion. They simply refuse to accept that the laws are the only things that matter." The report caused an uproar. 4 species demanded hearings. 2 demanded Hadley be court-martialed for breaking formation. 1 species, the Finari, demanded he be given a medal. The Palori said nothing officially, but Grosk sent Hadley a bottle of something that smelled like engine fuel and tasted like fire, which was apparently the highest compliment a Palori warrior could give. The War Council debated for weeks. Then they did something that had not been done in 200 years. They voted to rewrite the Concord Tactical Doctrine. The new manual was distributed to every fleet in the Alliance. On the first page, in bold text that looked out of place among the Tesheri equations and Palori combat diagrams, was a single human phrase: improvise, adapt, overcome. Hadley read the manual in his quarters aboard the Avalon. He smiled, set it down, and looked out the viewport at the stars. Priya found him there an hour later. The Council wants to assign you to the 3rd Fleet. Apparently, the Shivari are massing near the Kovari border. Of course they are. They also want you to teach a course on unconventional tactics at the War Academy. Hadley laughed. What would I even call it? Priya leaned against the doorframe and thought about it. How about, the laws of motion are suggestions? Hadley looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Close enough.